Welcome back to the virtual speaker series. As always, my name is Aiden and I use the pronouns he, his, and him. And today we're joined by Jack Radanovich, who is an intervention education intern for the Cal Poly Safer program. He's going to be presenting on gender-based and power-based violence and how they're related to toxic masculinity. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for being here, Jack, and I'm really excited to hear what you have to share with us today.
Thank you, Adian. I'm so excited to be here and can't wait to get started. So to contextualize our discussion today, I want to give a brief introduction to SAFER and the preventative strategies that we use. So as many of you already probably know, Cal Poly, SAFER is Cal Poly's primary confidential resource addressing gender and power-based violence, such as sexual assault, dating and domestic violence, sex trafficking, sexual harassment, stalking, and more. And so within SAFER, we have the prevention education branch and the confidential advocacy branch. The first of which, the prevention education branch, we center our work around the belief that violence is preventable and that everyone in our community has a role in preventing violence. And so we believe that if we operate as a collective force in our society to change norms around gender and power, there is a future where violence is not the norm and where positive, healthy relationships are the standard. And so within prevention education, we offer individualized presentations and workshops, prevention consultations, road training, peer-to-peer education. We have the SAFER leadership training, which is really great. That's how I got interested in SAFER. And we have various engagement opportunities, such as my internship. And so on the other side of things, within the confidential advocacy branch, we offer emotional support and crisis intervention, safety planning, campus accommodations, any resources related to survivorship and gender and power-based violence. The confidential advocacy branch is for that. And so to access the confidential advocacy branch, we've been operating remotely since March 2020. And so we have developed different online scheduling tools, such as online form here and the Calendly appointment feature. You can also call us at our number. And throughout the presentation, there will be QR codes in the bottom right of the slide. And so that will also take you to the online form to set up an appointment. And so now I really just want to transition into talking about our work at SAFER and how we approach prevention. And so we use public health models and we integrate their insights to really understand the roots of violence and understand the best methods for preventing it. And so in doing that, we look at, this model and we find that our work sort of aligns with the primary base where we focus on, things that we can do that prevent violence before it even occurs. And so that's pretty much what the prevention education branch focuses on, while the tertiary and secondary branches are the focus of the survivor wellness side of SAFER. And in thinking about that, we use these public health and sociological paradigms to understand and prevent violence. And so looking at this pyramid as sort of a visual representation, at the base, we have different ideologies, such as rigid gender roles, sexual norms, victim blaming, and all of these things contribute to the normalization of violence. And as we ascend the pyramid, we see that these patterns of normalization escalate into, interpersonal manifestations of violence. And we see at the apex, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and even homicide. And so our work in SAFER really recognizes how these systems at the very base, racism, sexism, homophobia, all serve as the foundation and edifice for the interpersonal displays of violence that we see and reckon with in our community. I think that really transitions into our topic of toxic masculinity, and thinking about how, gender as a system of power um, operates and intersects with gender power-based violence.
Thank you. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit about more specifically about toxic masculinity traits, what those might look like. You already talked about this concept of dominance and how that can lead to aggression and, at the very top of the pyramid, even, homicide or killing somebody. So we could explain a little bit more about that.
So when we're talking about toxic masculinity, we're thinking about behaviors, like you were saying, that are tied to aggression, tied to control, and anger, and really thinking about oneself as the consolidation of power in that space. And so any behaviors that are consistent with that, um, you know, and that's, intimately tied to, you know, heterosexuality and heteronormativity and things like that. And so behaviors consistent with that, I would say, are, indicative of toxic masculinity and that cause harm, and those behaviors that cause harm.
That's eventually what we're trying to prevent by having discussions about toxic masculinity is that harm that comes to others. And that's not to say that toxic masculinity doesn't cause harm to the individual as well, because we know that people who engage in traits of toxic masculinity are less likely to seek assistance, help, especially related to um, problems psychologically, like depression and other sorts of anxiety disorders as well, which can lead to issues later down the line that affect other individuals. So, yeah, certainly toxic masculinity plays a big role in not only the lives of the people who practice it, but the ones around them.
Right. And I really think that's an important insight that we need to think about how toxic masculinity is pervasive and all lives are affected by that, its, persistence, and thinking about that is really important. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Absolutely.
It seems that toxic masculinity doesn't really serve anyone in a positive way. So, what might be perpetuating that?
Well, I would say that toxic masculinity also is, and its development is an inherently racialized process. And so when we're thinking about, history of racism in this country, um, we know that notions of masculinity are deeply tied into that. And so thinking about, hegemonic masculinities, the prototypical man is the white heterosexual middle class man, and how that construction imposes controlling images onto men of color, particularly about what it means to be a Black man or what it means to be an Asian man. And we see these really confining, rigid gender norms as a way for white man to reassert their dominance and their masculinity over men of color. And so I think that's one way that manifests itself.
Certainly, and I'm glad you brought up that cultural, racial, and ethnic lens because that is a huge part of an individual's identity. Not only is their gender identity important, but also those factors as well. Um, and certainly, yeah, when you think about that, when you think about how the majority or the race, the white individuals in society influence the minority race, yeah, it is a lot about control and it is a lot about power. And certainly that makes a lot of sense when I ask that question. Who does this benefit? Who does the perpetuation of toxic masculinity traits benefit? And certainly, the individuals in power do benefit from that by limiting these individuals to those rigid structures. So yes, absolutely. And thinking about that cultural identity, that racial and ethnic identity in relation to masculinity, I was wondering if you might have some insight as to how you can also find benefits in those identities when it comes to masculinity.
I think that, finding healthy masculinities really is a process of self-discovery, not only in an individual context, but within that group context. And I think that through history, we find examples of positive masculinity through different leaders and different, images and um, diverse images in our communities. And I think that um, constructing healthy, positive masculinity is really about framing our work around justice and really putting the rights of others um, at the forefront of our collective consciousness as masculine identifying people.
That justice aspect is a huge part of what we try to do at M&M is create healthy masculinity concepts to be embodied by others so that we can achieve that justice for even those who don't identify within the masculine spectrum. And we have been talking a lot about masculinity as its own kind of entity. I wanted to also bring up this concept of femininity and compare that to masculinity because a lot of the times when we're talking about masculinity or femininity, they're dichotic or they're mutually exclusive from each other. But we know that this isn't necessarily true. We know that men don't necessarily only ascribe to masculine traits, and women or women identifying individuals don't ascribe to feminine traits because there is a lot of overlap. But for some reason, we continue to talk about them as two separate entities. I was wondering if you had any insight on that.
Right. So yeah, like as you were saying, I think that um, we have to remember that masculinity and femininity really are social creations and products of a social and political history. And so recognizing, not necessarily the differences, but the similarities between the two, I think can create spaces where people are more comfortable in their gender and their expression. And so for so long, toxic masculinity has really at its core represented a rejection of femininity in all ways. And I think that if we're to really sort of deconstruct toxic masculinity, we have to talk about incorporating the positive aspects of femininity into our healthy masculinities.
Studies have shown actually that men who engage in traits of femininity or what stereotypically was considered feminine are actually serve as better partners in heterosexual relationships. And I say heterosexual relationships because the field of psychology is fairly limited in the individuals it studies, but I imagine it would also apply to other forms of relationships. But yeah, that's an interesting thing because I think inherently people assume that if you have someone who's strong in masculine traits and someone else who's strong in feminine traits, that there's some sort of cohesion because of that. Because some reason people think that putting two opposite things together makes a good thing. But what it's found is that people or men who engage in feminine traits like nurturing, caring, listening, emotional expression are better partners. Um, in thinking about that, I think that demonstrates, for one, the importance of the overlap of feminine traits into the lives of men, for one thing, but also that there's a large benefit to that, and for some reason it may not be as well known that having these feminine traits is a good thing. And I feel like a lot of times when men in society express feminine traits, usually you'll find that other men dissuade or discourage the expression of those traits, even though they're beneficial. So that's obviously harmful because it's hurting the cohesion of society, in a way, if you will. So yeah, I was kind of wondering what you think should be done to address that kind of that desire to separate femininity by men in society. How can we include femininity? How can we encourage people to adapt those traits that are beneficial?
Through education and through, like I was saying, disrupting those structural conditions, we can create a society that's conducive for that behavior and for the sort of adoption of those beneficial feminine traits. And so by that I mean, like I was sort of challenging those social institutions that are rooted in sexism and um, genderism. Um, and then at the same time, having, a culture, whether it be on just a community level or a societal level, that facilitates a healthy relationship with femininity, and being able to sort of embrace the fluidity that comes with gender. And so I think that developing sort of more of an open space where everyone is allowed to create their own boundaries around their gender would be the first step in masculine identifying people sort of integrating those feminine traits into their identity.
Yeah, that fluidity of gender is an important concept because, as you mentioned earlier, the rigidness is part of the problem in terms of when you think about sexual assault, violence, aggression, those types of things. Because when you're in those rigid structures of masculinity, you don't have a lot of alternatives. So you do have to expand outside of those into the realms of what might be feminine characteristics to create healthy personas, healthy personalities. So yes, absolutely. Yeah, I think that covers a lot of what we're also trying to foster at the Men Masculinities program. It's a lot about not only examining critically toxic masculinity traits and examining why they don't benefit anyone, but also encouraging that integration and that expression of those feminine traits, and they're just human traits at some point because expression of emotion is important, and it being nurturing, being caring, being kind, like these aren't necessarily dichotic traits, they should be universal traits. And I think breaking down those two concepts and kind of molding them, like you said, the fluidity is a primary step into not only prevention of sexual assault, but also just better benefits for everyone who engages in that. I mean, think about mental health even. That would greatly benefit a lot of men and masculine identifying individuals by being able to be open and honest about how they are feeling emotionally and mentally. Yeah, so certainly those are key concepts for progress forward.
No, I totally agree. And, that sort of made me think of, you know, today with our work in restorative justice, and thinking about, after an incident of violence occurs, how do we create accountability processes that sort of really address the root of the violent instance that occurred? And I think that part of that would be addressing toxic masculinity for a perpetrator, and really sort of interrogating how masculinity, and how maybe different toxic masculine traits sort of informed their decision to commit an act of violence on another human being. And so that sort of led me to think about that.
And so we do know from research that those who prescribe more closely to the traits of masculinity that are considered toxic are more likely to commit sexual assault. So certainly going back to the root of what caused that is an important step, especially in restorative justice. Yeah, absolutely. All that is very important to say.
Yeah, if you want to share some of the resources that are available through the Safer program, I think this would be a great time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad to do so. Here are some safer contacts. We have within the prevention side of things, Jennifer McMartin, who is our prevention specialist, and Ashley Hernandez, who is our project coordinator for the Department of Justice. And so if you have any prevention or general questions, you can direct them to them. And then we have our advocates on the other side. We have Gillian Cutshaw, who is our campus advocate. We also have Sarah Wilson, who is our campus advocate, and you can find her information on the SAFER website. And then we have Kara Samaniego, who is our director of well-being. And so if you have any questions related to advocacy, or would like to set up an appointment to meet with an advocate, or need any resources, you can contact them, and also refer to the QR code for any of those needs too. And so then just for some broader resources on campus nationally, We have SAFER, we have counseling services, Title IX, and the Cal Poly Police. Off campus within the SLO community, we have RISE, which focuses on sexual assault and domestic violence. Then we have Stand Strong, which focuses on domestic violence, particularly. And then we have the San Luis Obispo Police. And then nationally, we have the sexual assault hotline that you can call out that number. They also have an online chat available, which is great. And then the domestic violence hotline and the crisis text line. And so all these resources with an asterisk next to them are confidential. And so, yeah, those are the resources.
Yeah, thank you. I always like to include the resources just because you never know who's going to be watching and who can benefit from those. So that is the end of our episode. I want to say thank you so much, Jack, and thank you so much, Safer. I hope that this does bring some insight into ideas of masculinity, toxic and otherwise.
And hopefully we have made some sort of change, some difference for our viewers. So I do want to say thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here to sort of share our ideas and think about ways that we can prevent violence while examining masculinity. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, that concludes this episode. If you want to learn more about any of those resources Jack mentioned, I'll leave the QR code up at the end of the video, and I'll also put links for SAFER as well as the Men Masculinity program down below. We're still in February, which means it's still Black History Month, and Cal Poly has a variety of events planned that you can check out, and I'll leave a link for the calendar if you want to learn more information about that. And with that, I'd like to say thank you for watching, stay safe, and I hope to see you next time on the Virtual Speaker Series.